Well, I think everybody knows that this is an area in which there are incredibly strongly held views, and that the debate can get very toxic because of that. People are actually afraid to talk openly.
Science! What is it good for? Absolutely some things. Clean energy? Good. Nuclear weapons? Bad. Trans healthcare? Good. Keeping Jair Bolsonaro alive? Bad. Science is a tool. It is neither inherently good nor bad, but the people who use this tool are not objective. Scientists are a mixed bag, like any other group. Carl Sagan, for example, was an excellent communicator, but also a fuckboy who just happened to have a voice like maple syrup dripping down... I'll end that sentence there. Neil deGrasse Tyson inspired a whole generation of black scientists, but he did some, bad things. In 2014, Tchia Ahmet accused Neil deGrasse Tyson of rape while they were both graduate students in astronomy at UT Austin, ultimately leading to her dropping out of the program. Other stories of sexual harassment followed, from an astronomy professor and from a production assistant on Cosmos. Richard Dawkins, well...
The only thing I can think to top that is identify as a dog. I mean...
I'll get to him. One day. For now, however, I'm not here to talk about the people who use the tool of science for both good and for bad, but about the process itself. Specifically, how the author of a derivative series about boy wizards who became megacops after beating wizard Hitler by default doesn't understand it. And the implications of the fact that so many people apparently are just as ignorant. You see, science isn't something one guy just does in a room by himself. Good science requires scrutiny, and almost all scientific endeavours come from collaboration. For the majority of the most groundbreaking discoveries of our time and all time, we can't thank a lone genius for their efforts, but instead we have to thank a team of tens if not hundreds of people, whose work is then scrutinised by their colleagues, torn to pieces if the process is done right, to make sure everything holds up to even the fiercest critics. This is part of the process we call peer review. In an ideal world anyway. In practice, scientists are overworked, underpaid, and a lot of them are of very similar demographics. So a lot of the things that get through peer review absolutely shouldn't. A very easy fix for this would be to pay people to do the peer review. What a revelation, paying people to do labour. And to guarantee publications for replicating papers instead of what happens now, which is replications are almost never published, and so in practice anyone who takes the time to hold people to the proper scrutiny are punished by their employers for not getting enough papers out. Also, people should get paid for publishing papers, but that's all besides the point. I wrote about a lot of this in my video on academia, which I'll link below. My point is that peer review is essential, but also often done badly. And part of the problem with this is that a lot of lay people hear the term and just assume they know what it means, despite being completely ignorant to the point of, well, being J. Jonah Jameson K. Rowling.
Crap, mega crap. I'll give you $200 for all of them. Tear up page 1, run that photo instead. Headline?
A trans person.
Hero or menace?
But who am I to be commenting on what is and isn't peer review? Well, I'm glad you asked. I am the one, the only, Brigitte Empire. The only name that's more on the nose than J.K. Rowling's alter ego and architect of conversion therapy, Robert Galbraith. And I am, for my sins, science and culture correspondent for peer-reviewed, 100% credible scientific juggernaut, the Daily Telegraph. At least according to J.K. Rowling, because Lord Nonsbottom, our humble editor, does in fact still technically sit in the House of Lords, despite having not left his office in 800 years. And as a peer who reviews my work, everything we write, according to J.K. Rowling, is peer-reviewed. We've been working on getting Dan a peerage too, but we've had 30 Prime Ministers since we last promised that was going to happen, so I think our letters have just got lost in the mail or something. I don't need a peerage myself, you see. I already have a title, in the way of a PhD from an accredited university. And by accredited, I mean that it's an ex-polytechnic, whose reputation is basically non-existent. Regardless, I do have a PhD. And my PhD was reviewed. I went through several changes as a result, which made it a more thorough and well-structured piece of work. In addition to that, I have a few scientific publications under my belt, each of which had to go through actual real peer review before they could be published. Sometimes these reviews were fair, such as asking me to be more specific with my methods to make them more repeatable, adding important elements to the study to fill in huge gaps. All that stuff that genuinely makes a study go from fine to great. And some reviews were less good. Like that time I tried to publish a paper on using voluntary schemes in museums to get experience on marginalised groups while updating knowledge of collections in local museums that never get looked at by big-time paleontologists. And one of my reviewers basically responded by saying, "No, you can't do that. A professor has to do it," which, well, I think that kind of missed the entire point. But that's how these things go. It's not always fair. Sometimes I think it genuinely gets in the way of important work getting out there, especially when there's a conflict of interest. But it's also necessary in trying to hold back the tide of bad science and shoddy work, especially in the age where scientists are judged entirely on how many papers they published, which encourages people to do shit work faster, rather than what most of us would like, which is a system where people have the time and financial security to be thorough, well-evidenced, and meticulous. What I'm trying to say is, I've seen the good and the bad of peer review. And most importantly, I know what it is. Which is why J.K. Rowling, coming out to her millions of followers and saying, "Peer review is when someone reviews stuff," gave me an aneurysm.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
Some of you in this audience might remember my feature-length video on the 300-and-something page-long hate-filled handbook that the British government commissioned to justify sending trans people to conversion therapy and banning healthcare for any of us under 25. That is commonly known as the Cass Review, or, as I kept saying in the video, the Cass Report. I don't know why I kept mixing those words up. I think report just sounds better, and to be honest, I should have been trying to make it sound worse, so if anything I should have just said it was a review the British government pulled out of its Cass. Anyway, the Cass Review was a manual for the government to legitimise the decisions it had already made regarding trans people, namely punishing us for existing by excluding any science that showed positive outcomes for trans healthcare, which just happens to be the majority of the science on trans healthcare. The thing is, when the government commissions these reviews, it has the final word on how it's made, who does it, and who reviews it, despite however much they want to say it's independent. We saw with the way the government commissioned the Sewell Report to give an independent opinion that Britain had no systemic racism, after the Lamy Report told them answers they didn't want to hear about Britain, namely that the British state has racism etched into its very bones. Now, there were some studies released as a part of the Cass Review that did go through peer review to be published elsewhere, but a lot of it was not. And good science needs to be thoroughly scrutinised, not rubber-stamped by Kemi Badenoch and the 500 hate groups that both the Conservative and Labour parties are constantly in competition to see which of them can wank them off the hardest by promising answers to the trans question that would make Margaret Thatcher blush. Actually, that's not really fair, because people without souls can't blush. I guess it'd make the piss on her grave a more demure shade of yellow or something.
First of all, I welcome the Cass Review, and I want to thank Hilary Cass and her team for the thorough and thoughtful and careful and sensitive way in which they've undertaken this research.
We see it with men exposing themselves in bathrooms. We see it with people trying to access single-sex spaces, such as women's prisons, when they have been convicted for violence against women and their victims are being forced to refer to them with female pronouns. That is not right. That is not right. So we have to make sure that we can sweep all that away.
Anyway, in response to legitimate criticism of the Cass Review not having gone through sufficient peer review to be hailed as the ultimate answer to how to deal with all these damn transgenders, J.K. Rowling, author of celebrated novel The Casual Vacancy, and such wonderful prose as, "A great apron of stomach, filled so far down in front of his thighs that most people thought instantly of his penis when they first clapped eyes on him." So a cool and normal person whose brain isn't completely broken by obsessing about other people's genitals. Oh, wait, there's more? Wondering when he had last seen it, how he washed it, how he managed to perform any of the acts for which a penis is designed. Huh. Okay, so celebrated author of whatever that was. Jesus Christ Rowling took up the banner of defending this novel-length hate screed commissioned by the UK government by demonstrating that she has no idea how peer review works. In her own words, "The Cass Review is itself peer review. An experienced, unbiased, highly qualified specialist reviewed the evidence for transitioning children and concluded that experimental treatments had been given to them without a solid evidence base. It's a crazy idea. Why not read it?" So, I did read it. And not only is that not what it demonstrates, but that also isn't what peer review means, like, at all, in any way or circumstance. Rowling seems to think, judging from this statement, that peer review is when you are a peer and you review something. So by me making this video, I have apparently put Rowling's tweet through peer review. And rather than peer review being a process by which a scientific paper is scrutinised by a number of colleagues in different institutions, poking around and trying to find fault with every single word you've written to make sure it's as tight as possible and doesn't contradict knowledge that they know to be true, peer review in science would actually be like that time me and my friends saw the Microraptor fossil in Nottingham. And while I was staring in awe at this beautifully preserved, four-winged feathered dinosaur, by some miracle on display in my home city, he walked up to me and whispered in my ear, bit shit, innit? Here's the thing though, if you do a review, that's not peer review. A review, no matter what you call it, still requires peer review to reach the baseline standards for good science. In a peer review of the Cass report, you would encounter a bunch of the criticisms I highlighted in my last video, from various organisations tearing apart the review standards for quality research, its wild conclusions, the bias of the reviewer as someone who met with a bunch of anti-trans people and organisations and previously worked on getting trans healthcare banned in Florida, you know, what we in the scientific community like to call basic scrutiny. You don't get to avoid being held to account just because you called your work a review. If I called this video the Rowling review, it wouldn't be considered a rigorous example of scientific inquiry. It would be considered a silly little video that tries to educate you on what peer review is and isn't, while poking fun at the mother of all transphobes. Which, for the record, is what this is. Some parts of the Cass review did go through this process, going to editors at a journal who gave critiques and sent copies to relevant experts who gave critiques, preventing publication of the paper until the reviewers and editors had been satisfied. This is peer review, and it often makes good science better, but it also isn't perfect. It often isn't nearly enough. It doesn't catch everything, and hell, it sometimes misses very important things. And this is made more complicated by the fact that often a study's author can suggest people to conduct the review, which could, in the case of the Cass review, mean that you could publish an incredibly bad faith anti-trans paper recommending known transphobes as reviewers and asking not to have people sympathetic to trans people as reviewers. Now, I understand why this happens. Some people are just not nice, and you don't want to send a review to someone with a personal grudge against you and your colleagues, which is unfortunately extremely common, because some scientists have egos the size of a small planet. Most scientists. But I think this can lead to quite bad outcomes on occasion. So, peer review isn't perfect. It doesn't mean every study that goes through peer review is beyond reproach. Far from it. It's kind of the bare minimum. Part of the ongoing process of science is that people can write reviews and responses to papers that have already been published, already gone through the first round of review. And often because these reviews are less time sensitive and are rarely published unless their critiques are necessary and make serious accusations with good grounding in science, there are really important critiques in here which can and should make us think twice about just taking a peer-reviewed paper at its face. Which is something we shouldn't do anyway. We should look at every piece of science with skepticism. Rowling, however, would have us believe that any review, or at least the ones that agree with her, are peer-reviewed. And as a result, beyond criticism. The final word on the subject. The ultimate truth sent from on high, like Jesus on the mountain top. That was Moses. One of the Bible guys. The truth is far from that. Even if it were to be peer-reviewed, which it is not, it would be more than ripe for critique. In fact, critique is necessary to ensure the contents of the review aren't utter shite. And, I'm afraid, the sheer volume of criticism of the Cass review suggests that its contents are, indeed, to use the scientific term, utter shite. The critiques of the Cass review, for example, put out from Transactual, show that whatever reviewing took place, it wasn't good enough. And for the record, it wasn't peer-reviewed. But even just taking Rowling's word on this, which we shouldn't, it clearly didn't work. Peer review can fail. It's not beyond reproach. And if major problems remain within a piece of work, it should be challenged. And if the problems are genuinely dangerous, as is the case with the Cass review, or some of the papers referenced in the Cass review to draw its conclusions, like the Lisa Lippman study that invented rapid onset gender dysphoria to try and paint trans kids as a social contagion based on some opinions from some anti-trans forums and parents, then it should be retracted. The paper should be retracted. The review should be retracted. This is how serious you should take these things. This is how important reviews are. This is how important criticism is. This is the bare minimum, especially in matters of health. Hold people to account. Make sure you're not spreading dangerous information. Do not close the door as soon as someone with authority says it's okay. The government won't retract the Cass review because it's essentially a made-to-order work designed to justify what they already planned on doing. But if it was a genuine scientific endeavour, with integrity, it should be more than open to critique. It should be welcoming critique, and not declaring victory upon publication as if that's the end of the story. In science, publication is just the beginning. In fact, because the Cass review was a political document and not a scientific one, we have things like Cass go on a massive media tour acting like she's completed her work, despite it only now being open to public scrutiny. And more importantly, because the Conservatives have declared victory on its publication, we have Kemi Badenoch, the Women Inequality Secretary for the Fourth Reich, admitting that not only was the Cass review a political project from the very start, but that it was explicitly designed to send to anti-trans hate groups and produce recommendations that discriminated against trans people explicitly. In her own words,
"The third reason England has taken a global lead when it comes to banning puberty blockers was having gender-critical men and women in the UK government, holding the positions that mattered most in equalities and health. You need only look at what the SNP did in Scotland to see what would have happened had we not intervened. The Cass review would never have been commissioned under a Labour government. Labour did not want to know. We had incredible opposition from the system on everything. It was when the ministers changed that everything changed." And so, according to the people that commissioned, then championed the Cass review, it was impossible to get the outcomes they wanted from a review into trans people with the staff they had coming into this process. As a reminder, this is after 10 years of Tory government. These are not people who will work against the Tories on purpose. They're perfectly comfortable with serving their agenda, or at least acting as an apolitical agent. Instead, the Cass review was made possible by changing the personnel in every department that was critical of the aims of Badenoch and her transphobia, until it was stacked wall to wall with anti-trans bigots. On purpose. Every single employee that got in their way removed so that they could perform this function. They admitted this. Even if we were to take Rowling's "a peer reviewed this" attitude to what makes peer review, which we absolutely should not, the deck was already stacked, deliberately, with the intention of making the equalities and health staff in the UK government actively hostile to trans people, so that they could punish us without pushback simply for existing. This kind of thing is why peer review is important in the first place, for pointing this stuff out, for challenging pre-established biases. But it's also what peer review often fails the most at, because the kind of people who get far enough in universities and other workplaces to be reviewers tend to be the kind of people who are most blind to systemic biases. But we don't even need peer review to point this out, because Kemi Badenoch just came right out and said it. This was not a legitimate scientific work. It was designed from the top to the bottom to make trans people's lives hell. And despite what the British government, the British press, and yes, J.K. Rowling would like to admit, now that the Cass review is out in public, people can come out now and give structured critiques. People who actually specialise in this stuff. People who aren't exclusively frothing at the mouth bigots. For example, just last week at the time of writing these, a crucial commentary on the biological and psychosocial evidence used in the Cass review was published in the International Journal of Transgender Health. And more of these critiques will come in as time goes on. The Cass review is almost 400 pages long, and proper critique, proper peer review, takes time. The Conservatives declared victory immediately, but the more time passes, the more the scientific community will do what it's supposed to do, and try and hold this review to account. Rowling's words ultimately hold no weight in the scientific community, at least in this case. And if the press and the government were wise, they'd hold off on their celebrations too. But they won't. Because while this is being argued in scientific journals and conferences,
people on the street will only hear the final word given by the press and the government. And they together have already decided how they're going to spin it. And that's in a dangerous direction indeed. Instead, they should keep in mind what this new review says about the standards of evidence used in the Cass review, which I will quote directly from now. Overall, this commentary highlights numerous issues with the scientific substantiation of the biological and psychosocial claims made by the Cass review. Where quantitative data is referenced or included, statistical measures are missing, the claims about trends and difference between groups. In addition, in several claims, a balanced discussion of the available literature lacks, and varying standards for quality and evidence are used throughout this review. In addition, the review makes a number of contradictory assertions. These issues point towards poor scientific rigour in the evidence collation and dissemination, leading to potentially wrong conclusions and recommendations. Although the current commentary focuses on the biological and psychosocial evidence presented in the Cass review, other issues with the review and its processes have previously been raised. This article raises a number of similar concerns discussed here, in particular, inconsistent standards of evidence. However, further concerns regarding prejudice and cis-normative bias are also examined. Although science claims to be fully impartial, it never exists in a vacuum, and the confounding factors discussed by Horton should be considered carefully when interpreting the review. One of the central recommendations of the review is the discontinuation of puberty blockers as standard practice for trans children within the NHS. As this is in direct conflict with long-standing international standards of care, it would be expected this recommendation is supported by substantial question about its positive effects of puberty blockers and/or overwhelming evidence of their adverse effects. Such evidence is not presented in the Cass review. Similarly, the Cass review argues that there is insufficient evidence of long-term positive effects of hormone treatment in adolescents, recommending against early treatments, again directly contradicting international standards and the large number of studies used to develop these standards. All in all, this commentary raises numerous concerns regarding the biological and psychosocial evidence in the Cass review. These concerns include inferring trends and causality about demographic trends and comorbidities within statistical substantiation, misrepresenting results from the literature, varying thresholds for the inclusion of studies, and using unbalanced evidence or references to make one-sided claims. Together, these concerns call into question whether the review is able to provide sufficient evidence to substantiate its recommendations to deviate from WPATH's international standard of care for trans children. That's pretty damning, right? See, these are the criticisms that matter, and this is just the beginning. This kind of scrutiny is what peer review is for. These are the voices we should be listening to regarding the Cass review, not those of J.K. Rowling, Kemi Badenoch, or the legions of conservative ghouls that haunt the halls of every British newspaper office. No offence, Dan. There is more where this came from. And as the 2024 election approaches, I can only hope the next government will actually listen to this criticism, instead of doing what they're openly saying they're going to do, as Wes Streeting's Shadow Health Minister has clearly laid out, and implementing the horrifically bad science of the Cass review's recommendations in full. It's a sad day when I hope that politicians are lying, but the alternative is very dark indeed, so vote Green, the least transphobic of the major parties, I suppose, or independents, or individual candidates. Oh my god. I miss Corbyn's Labour. I need a drink. While I go get one and cry about our future, remember, the science is on our side. Cass had to throw away so many studies for spurious reasons to get the result the Conservatives have rearranged 2 whole government departments for. That tells us a lot. It tells us that we will win. It's just going to be a hard fight. But as I've heard many times these last few years, it's called the struggle for a reason. Take heart, and don't listen to second-rate authors about what peer review is. I don't try and tell Rowling the rules of the wizarding world, even though I think I could probably do a better job. Huh. Well, here's to peer review. Actual peer review, not whatever Rowling and her parade of screeching clowns have convinced themselves it is. And while you're here, why not be my peer and review me by liking, commenting, subscribing, joining my Patreon, donating to my new PC fund and GoFundMe, oh god help me, my computer is dying, and by telling me that I passed your peer review, after which I can be confident that my face can be published in a leading scientific journal. Publish my face. Until then, thanks for watching. Science What is it good for? Absolutely something. Hey, thank you for watching the end of this video. I've already mentioned most of the good stuff at the end of this. But yeah, I've got a GoFundMe. Please donate to it. I need to save my computer from dying so I can continue doing these videos for you all and for myself. And I'll start streaming if we do that every couple of weeks or every week or however it works out, depending on what my schedule is like. And keep making these videos at pace, if not faster, because I won't have to deal with the ridiculous wait times for exports like I usually do. But if you've done that and you've still got some money, you can also give me money on Coffee or PayPal. Links below, as always. Or sign up to my Patreon. You get to go on the Discord with all my friends. The Switch friend code for the Nintendo. Exclusive content. You like Princess Weeks or Rosencreutz or Jessie Gender. I've got talks with them. In addition to all that good stuff, I'll read your name out at the end. And wouldn't you listen to how good these names are? Wouldn't your name sound so good next to these names? Those names are Deborah LeBun, Vegas, Zilla Zathanium, Vince Whitaker, Amelia Unchained, Sarah Rudston, Jason Haig, Frank McManus, Susan Foster, Helena, Sierra Whiskey, Restria, Ali Catkill, John N, Scully, Jan, Lloyd Luciente, Jason Cribbett, Shield Vaden, Robin Podolsky, Exploding Turtle, Casual Observer, Terry Roberts, Manta Ray, Courtney Burmack, Sleepy Slug, Philippa Tabrogga, Soma Piglet, Brain Douche, Artie Wolf, Hayden Gayler, Greg Noble, Deanna McMillan, Caroline Regalado, Alexandra Lilly, Howard Lott, Narania Scarjan, and Joey Cobalt. Thank you so much, guys. See you next time.